Yeah, this is definitely the exact type of video that I made this whole Barbershop Talk series for. Who's the greatest scorer in NBA history? That's a topic that's general enough that I wouldn't make a whole in-depth video about it on the main channel, but interesting enough that I will sit down and just give some thoughts about it. The greatest scorer of all time is such an interesting conversation because there's so many ways to look at it. So you'll look at a guy like Wilt Chamberlain or someone who was as dominant as Shaquille O'Neal and just talk about how easy it was for them to score. But then does that give them grounds to be in the greatest scorer of all time conversation? Well, okay, that's the wrong way to put it. They're definitely there in the conversation, but when you actually get down to that #1 spot, can you justify it? Because Wilt Chamberlain had 4,000 points in the season, which to my knowledge I believe is the most points anyone's ever had. Or you look at someone like Kareem's 38,000 points. That's ridiculous, and right now I don't know if anyone's on track to break that. There would have to be some amazing things to happen between a player like LeBron or Kevin Durant. They would have to do some pretty incredible things for a couple of more years, or more than a couple of more years, to reach that. But does that make Kareem the greatest scorer of all time? By the numbers, he's the greatest scorer of all time, but I think most people have other guys in mind. So what I'm gonna do is tell you that I'm not trying to discriminate against big men and centers, but that's exactly what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna discriminate between big men and centers in this conversation because I'm just gonna be real with you. I don't have them as my greatest scorer of all time. Despite Kareem's points, despite Wilt's crazy season, I don't have them as the greatest scorer of all time. To me, this conversation breaks down between 3 people in my opinion. And then I only have 2 players that have a serious case to be called the greatest scorer of all time at the #1 spot. The 3 players I have in mind are Kobe Bryant, Kevin Durant, and Michael Jordan. And to me, those are the players that they have numbers to support the argument, but it's also what you saw, because numbers, that's the whole reason I'm not discussing Kareem or Wilt Chamberlain here, because numbers don't tell the whole story, right? Numbers don't show you how a guy actually scored, his craft, his footwork, the amount of ways that he could score. Numbers aren't going to show you all of that. So it has to be a combination of what you saw, or what you've studied, and then the numbers to go with that. And I think those are the 3 players that are in that conversation. Then out of those 3, I think it's between Kevin Durant and Michael Jordan. That's my opinion. I think what separates them from Kobe Bryant, even though Kobe had ridiculous tears of like 9 straight 40-point games or how many 60-point games he had, I think the #1 thing that would separate them is the efficiency. And like I said, Kobe made it into that conversation because I've seen the ways that he can score. However, he's definitely not a 50% shooter like Michael Jordan and Kevin Durant pretty much are. They're sitting right at 49% for their career. So it's definitely, efficiency separates them in my opinion right there. So then we look at KD and MJ, and this is really, really interesting because when you think about it, so many people don't appreciate KD for obvious reasons right now, but we very well could be watching the greatest scorer of all time, right? And I'm pretty sure this is an opinion most of y'all have, and this is why everyone's so mad at him for going to Golden State. He's 7 feet tall, he can handle the ball, and there's not one way to score that he can't accomplish. He can shoot the 3 ball, and he can shoot it far too, right? Only a few steps in from where Steph Curry can probably shoot. KD is right there with that. Mid-range shots, mid-range pull-ups, just doing anything off the dribble, he can do that. Getting to the rim, putting his back to the basket and fading away like Nowitzki with the whole, the whole thing he does with one leg. There's literally, I can't think of a way that Kevin Durant cannot score. Durant has 4 scoring titles, and who knows what's going to happen for the rest of his career or where he's going to play. It could be more. And so far to this point, he's got 4 seasons scoring over 2,000 points. And to this point, I think that the most amazing thing I ever saw from Kevin Durant was in 2014, because that's the year that Russell Westbrook went out. He was dealing with injuries, and it was the year that Kevin Durant won MVP. He averaged 32 points that year, and he did that on, 50%? Yeah, he did it on 50% shooting. He shot 39% from 3 that year. And the craziest thing about it was that without Westbrook, there wasn't a second legitimate scorer on that team. He had someone like Reggie Jackson, yeah, he was good at scoring, but I'm talking about other star talent to take the pressure off of him. So a lot of what he was doing was off the dribble. People were throwing double teams at him, and I have so many images and just like videos replaying in my head of that season of the amazing things that he was doing that it was no surprise that he won the MVP. So when you think about what I said a couple of minutes ago, talking about how he can score any way that you could possibly imagine, and you combine that with the type of season that he had in 2014, which was probably the most singular KD we've ever seen, right? Where his usage percentage was the highest because he simply didn't have anyone else on the floor to take the pressure off, and he responded like that. Things like that make you think you're fighting an uphill battle trying to argue that anybody could ever be a better scorer than him. Because right now, it's obviously a little bit toned down. He's still an amazing scorer, but he's playing on a team with so many all-stars that we don't see the Kevin Durant from 2014, and we might never see it again depending on who he plays with for the rest of his career. But sticking with our argument of looking at numbers and looking at what you can actually see, what's still on tape and how a player scored, it's honestly, and this might surprise you, it's difficult to argue that Kevin Durant is a better scorer than Michael Jordan was. I'll start this one with numbers because that's pretty much the easiest. So where I said Kevin Durant has so many seasons over 2,000 points, MJ has almost the same amount of seasons or more, whatever I said. MJ has 6 seasons over 2,500 points. Kevin Durant's highest scoring season in his career was 2,500. It was very close to 2,500. MJ has 6 of those seasons. MJ has the 10 scoring titles compared to KD, and KD is at 4 right now, and it's highly unlikely playing on the team that he's playing on right now that he'll ever reach 10. MJ had 8 seasons of 30 points per game, including one in which he scored 37 points per game. And I think the most impressive thing about Michael's scoring in terms of numbers, and I think it's very undervalued, look where he sits on the all-time scoring list. He's behind Kobe, Karl Malone, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, so there's 2 big men in front of him, and then there's Kobe. MJ sits at 32,000 points, and the most impressive thing about that is that he took about 4.5 prime years off, because when he retired in 1998, he was still at the top of his game. Okay, actually that's a bad phrase to use. He wasn't at the top of his game, but he was still the best player in the game. He was still averaging 29 points at age 34, which is not terribly old, but that was after retiring once, and he was never as efficient as he was before retirement. So in that year, he shot around 46-47% that year, which that was a bit low for MJ. But my point there is, after that, he didn't come back for 3 more years, and if he had of, it's easy to say he would have still stayed around the high 20s, right? So let's just be conservative here. Let's just say that Jordan drops off a little bit, because in the seasons that after he came back from his first retirement, he scored 2,491 points, 2,431 points, and 2,357 points. So let's just be conservative after 1998 and say age starts to catch up with him and he gradually slows down. And let's just say that he scores 2,000 points a season. So for those 3 more seasons that he plays as a Chicago Bull, we're just going to give him 6,000 points being conservative. Being conservative with those 3 seasons, those 6,000 points makes Michael Jordan the top of the scoring list. That puts him above Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. That's being conservative. And that's also not counting, let's say he doesn't retire for baseball. If he comes back and he plays all of 1995, or he doesn't even retire in 1994. That's 2 more seasons right there. That's a season and a half basically. So that's another close, and that's around when he was still scoring 2,500 points. That's what he was around back then, 2,500, 2,400. This man could have easily had 40,000 points in his career, very easily. So that's just on the number side of things. We're just doing analysis of trends, and the analysis of trends with where he was scoring says that you can be conservative and say MJ was going to end up with 40,000 points in his career, which puts him number 1 on the all-time scoring list. Okay, so now we ditch numbers and we look at, well, how did MJ score? Well, first of all, let's look at the game itself back in 1980s and 1990s, back then before the rules changed. Another thing that's discounted is that he was doing this in an era where rules weren't made to favor the offensive player, because it happened about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whenever the rule changed and it started favoring offensive players where you couldn't hand check anymore. A lot of players had their best offensive seasons once those rules changed. He was doing that in an era where the rules were totally different. They were not favoring offense, because they favor offense today because they want more entertainment, they want more fan interest, and fans are interested in offense. So that's one thing that's changed. Another thing that's changed is the spacing of the floor. Today, pretty much everyone's teammates can shoot. The big men can shoot, the power forwards, the centers, the point guards shoot now. The floor is way more spaced. So you have a situation where someone like KD, and I'm not discounting him being 7 feet tall and being able to handle the ball. This man is getting, especially on Golden State today, this man is getting hella open shots. And what I'm looking at is when Michael Jordan came into the league as a rookie. His first year, he scored 2,300 points, And then the year after he came back, right, where he had come back from the broken foot, this is the 1987 season, he scored 3,041 points, and that was on a team where his second best scorer was Charles Oakley. Charles Oakley was a big man, and I'm talking traditional big man back then, not somebody that could stretch the floor and, you know, could stand at the three-point line and give him space. That was his second best scorer in a season where he efficiently scored 3,000 points. I'm talking on 48%. And it was a good amount of time before Jordan got his star sidekick to where he could take some pressure off of himself offensively. And even when he got Pippen, he kept doing the scoring, right? But I'm saying, all those years before Pippen had developed, he was doing that on the floor with players that were not really taking that much pressure off of him, and he was doing it efficiently. And so then you go to, well, how do they score? Because like I said, KD, as a pure scorer, he probably does have the edge on Michael, right? Because he does have more ways to score by virtue of being 7 feet tall and having those ball handling skills, and his three-point shot is definitely better. He has more ways to score than MJ in that sense. But then look at, okay, well, who was the craftier scorer? Who had more moves? Who had more ways to get to their shots and get their shot offs? Who had the better footwork? Who had the better post game? To all those questions, the answer would be Michael. And it's one of those things that has to do with the type of players that they are, because the way KD is built, the way his body is built, he probably hasn't needed all those moves that MJ had, especially in the era that he plays in. MJ simply needed more ways to score, working in the mid-range and working where the floor doesn't have as much space. He needed more moves to get his shot off, whereas Kevin Durant, being 7 feet tall with ball handling skills, that's basically it. You can get your shot off anytime you want. You don't really need to have crafty posts, you know, shimmy shakes and all of that and fadeaways. You don't necessarily need all of that when you're Kevin Durant. But I think that from what I've seen, MJ is the craftier scorer than Kevin Durant. Their efficiency is about the same. They both shoot 49% for their careers. And then the numbers simply make this an argument that's too hard to prove for Kevin Durant. Like, reading Michael Jordan's totals off are ridiculous. 2,300, 3,000, 2,800, 2,600, 2,700, 2,500. That's just me reading to 1991 MJ scoring numbers. He kept going. 2,400, 2,500, 2004, 2004, 2003. Those are ridiculous scoring numbers, back to back to back all the time, 7 straight scoring titles. So then my final point to put here, and the final thing that would come up, is people would definitely ask, well, how many shots did Jordan take? How many shots did he take a game? And if you gave KD those same amount of shots, maybe Kevin Durant would score as much as MJ did, and then your numbers don't matter, right? And okay, because that's why I'm addressing this, MJ did shoot more than KD all the time. Like, he had 27 field goal attempts. He pretty much averaged around 22 for his career, whereas Kevin Durant averaged 18. And Jordan definitely has those really high attempts, 24, 27, 22. They're all above what Kevin Durant was averaging as far as attempts. But then look at the field goal percentage though, because for Mike, he shoots 49.7, Kevin Durant shoots 49. So with more attempts, MJ is still more efficient than Kevin Durant was in an era where the rules and spacing did not favor offensive players. So he took a lot more shots and he's still more efficient. If you gave Kevin Durant more shots, maybe his totals would look like Michael's, but maybe he wouldn't be as efficient because he's not as efficient now, even if it's by 0.7 of a point, still not as efficient. And that's with MJ taking a lot more shots, so that's my thought as far as the attempts. So now I'd like to know who you think is the greatest scorer of all time, and it might be somebody else other than MJ or Kevin Durant. But to me, like I said at the beginning of the video, looking at numbers and looking at actually how they scored, I think those are the two most logical arguments.